Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry the Movies with your host Jerry Saravia. So today we're going to take a look at Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, which came out in December of 2012, and this, as I'm sure many of you know, and especially Lord of the Rings fans out there, this is the first of a new trilogy written and directed by Peter Jackson. Initially, Peter Jackson was only going to be involved really as far as a producer, as far as producing it, and Guillermo del Toro, who made films like Pan's Labyrinth and a couple of other films that don't, well, actually the first one I remember seeing from him was a vampire movie. The titles are not very forthcoming. Chronos it was called. There you go. Anyway, so he had worked on it for at least I think a couple of years, and then it fell through, I guess because the financing was not necessarily as forthcoming, or the scheduling, or whatever the case may be. So Peter Jackson came back and directed The Hobbit. Again, the first of a new trilogy, based on a book that isn't really very long, but that's okay, because this is a lavishly mounted, extraordinarily intimate, and awesome fantasy adventure. I mean, it really, to me, blows away any other fantasy adventure films that I've seen since Jackson's own Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, which I thought was the best of the original trilogy. Now, Bilbo Baggins is on board, played by a younger actor named Martin Freeman, and Bilbo is a hobbit who happily smokes and eats in his own little house, and is approached one day by Gandalf the Grey, played by, of course, the always terrific Ian McKellen. And, well, I mean, what can you say? Gandalf is the wise old wizard who has summoned a league of extraordinary dwarfs to Bilbo's house. Bilbo knows precious little about Gandalf, because this tale takes place about 60 years before Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and is dismayed by all these dwarfs. And anyway, their mission is to, for the dwarfs to go back to their own homeland, called the Lonely Mountain, which had been lost to an intensely fire-breathing dragon named Smaug, who drove them out and killed many. Now, the dragons love gold, and this Smaug basically sleeps in it. So Gandalf wants to recruit the reluctant Bilbo as a burglar, which would help the dwarves enter their own Palace of Riches. On the way, the group confronts giant Scottish-accented trolls, a goblin king with ravaged, acne-scarred skin, and an oversized hanging chin. And then there's Radagast the Brown, a wizard who resides in a forest and keeps bird poop on his head. There's, of course, the return of Gollum, once again performed by Andy Serkis, who performs a game of riddles with Bilbo. And then there are the stone giants who try to crush each other, while our heroes hang on for dear life. And most memorably is Azog the Pale Orc, a dangerous creature who lusts for war and intends nothing but to kill all dwarfs. Naturally, there's been some resentment towards Bilbo, and that is true of the dwarf Thorin, a warrior who has a dislike for elves, and especially Azog. The Hobbit is just a delight from first frame to last. I mean, and it does everything with such ease, from one encounter with fantastical creatures after another to dwarfs singing and doing Bilbo's dishes. So there's a lot of humor, as you would expect, especially from, which was present in the original trilogy. The enormous vistas of Middle-earth, played by New Zealand, coupled with vast palaces covered on every inch of floor by gold, the Goblin King's fiery underground lair, the deep bluish starkness of Azog's surroundings, or the amber tones of Radagast's own treehouse, they add such great flavor and richness to this fantasy. Director Peter Jackson has also created, I think, the most convincing creatures I've ever seen in a fantasy film of this type, thanks to his creative Weta visual effects team. This particular story might seem a bit trifle next to the epic proportions of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, but that would be false advertising, because the Book of the Hobbit, which could have been mined for a 2-hour film or less, and of course it has been in the past in animated form, has been expanded by Jackson and his writers, including characters that were not even present in The Hobbit, which would be Saruman, played by Christopher Lee, and Galadriel, played by Cate Blanchett. But Jackson expands it with such flair and magical rhythm that it makes you forget its running time, which is close to 3 hours. And Martin Freeman is a complete wonder, I thought, as Bilbo, smart and witty, yet innocent of the dangers that lay ahead. And he's also got Ian Holm's feistiness, Ian Holm playing the elder Bilbo that you see in the beginning of this film, and of course who was present in the other Lord of the Rings films. Ian McKellen, what can one say, sublime as ever as Gandalf. Andy Serkis shows a more psychopathic, Gollum than we had anticipated in the years prior to Lord of the Rings. And finally, there's the rough and tough Richard Armitage as Thorin, a dwarf who shares some of Aragorn's cynicism, but is also changed by this hobbit who's along for the ride. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where this story goes, absolutely. What's most alluring and captivating, I think, about Jackson's return to Middle-earth is the intimacy. He didn't lose the intimacy. My favorite scene is when Gandalf explains to Galadriel his reaction to the bravery of Bilbo Baggins. And Gandalf speaks in such gentle tones and with such sympathy that it is extraordinarily moving. I mean, it just proves, once again, Peter Jackson's heart is in the right place. So definitely see The Hobbit if you haven't seen it already, or you've had reservations. There was minor controversy with this film. I think when he had shown a clip or two prior to the release of the film, because he shot the film in 48 frames per second, so that everything appears hyper real, almost fake looking, in other words, to some people. Now, I've not seen it this way. I've seen it in the typical traditional 24 frames per second, so I can't comment on that or the 3D effects, but seeing it in 2D is just fine, and at 24 frames per second. So check out The Hobbit for sure. I look forward to seeing where this tale goes. Having read the book, I'm very curious, but I like what I've seen so far very much, so please check it out. And this is Jerry the Movies. This is Jerry Saravia, signing off.